Sure, I'd be happy to say hello to everybody.
Okay, hang on one second. Let's do a spotlight. Yeah. And then we'll go.
Hi. Thank you guys for coming. Welcome to our Epoxy Putty Zoom class. We're going to get started in a few minutes, give a little bit more time for people to come in. But I see some friendly faces out there. Thank you guys so much for joining us tonight. So I'm Janessa. I'm here from Smooth On. And thanks to the Compleat Sculptor for hosting us. So we're going to be talking about and demonstrating the epoxy putties and how they work. And if you're not familiar with them, you don't have to follow along at home. This just gives you a better understanding of how they work and ways in which they can be used to help move your projects forward. I can ask, while people are coming in, who thinks they're here from furthest away? How far out do we have visiting us tonight? Feel free to enter in the chat, and if somebody is outside of the tri-state area, we're talking to you tonight from Pennsylvania.
Brian, we got Texas, Maine, Pennsylvania, Kansas.
Oh, Texas.
Wow, Kansas, Maine. Those are long walks from here. Texas, oh my goodness. Well, thank you guys so much for tuning in. I know we have a few different time zones then. This might be a little earlier or later, depending, what direction you're coming from. But thank you very much for joining us tonight. So just to let you know in advance, we are going to be taking a break midway through as well. So hopefully, if you need to stretch your legs, that's something about the middle of the presentation that we're going to give you a chance to step away from the screen and not feel like you've missed anything. But otherwise, we're going to move pretty straightforward in mixing material, showing you examples that are made from the materials and ways that you can use them that I think are really, really cool. I love sculpting and I love working with the epoxy putties for a lot of different reasons. So I'm hoping to show you some of my favorite things tonight in terms of what they can do. You are going to see, just to let you know, and I'll go over this in a little bit, I'm going to be using gloves a lot. Personal protection and safety is very important, and we are working with epoxies. We have a real well-ventilated area. I know that you're only seeing a small piece of it here, but you'll see me when I'm working with the materials using gloves in terms of personal protective equipment tonight. So do we have any questions getting started in terms of, has anyone used these materials before who's already in the room? Or is this brand new?
Seems like there's some new users.
Okay. All right. So that's exciting. I'm going to make sure to help explain the differences with the materials. If you do have questions about anything that you're seeing here, please, hold on to those questions or type them in the chat. I'll be able to answer them at the end of each of the sections. After I've mixed material, we have a section just there for questions like we were talking about before. I want to make sure everybody's questions gets answered as best I can tonight and keep everything moving. So, yeah. Want to make sure your question gets answered as best I can here tonight. All right. How are we in terms of the class itself? Do we have a good number of people here?
You're about 6 minutes in. I mean, anybody who's late now gets penalized, right? If they're late,
okay, let me know as people come on in when we're...
Okay. All right. So yeah, you're pretty good. You got 25 in, so you are ready to go.
Oh, wonderful.
All right. And most people are new to some of these materials, and everybody else seems to have, a little bit of limited experience. So I think the different applications will be really interesting for them to see.
Great, I think so too.
Awesome. So you can just vault in if you want.
All right, well, let's get started. So again, welcome. Thank you so much for being here tonight for our Epoxy Putties Zoom class. I'm here. My name's Janessa. I'm here from Smooth On. Thank you, Compleat Sculptor, for hosting us here tonight. And we're going to be showing some of these materials that are mixed by hand that are epoxy systems. We have quite a few. We're not going to be mixing all of them tonight, but we have a lot of information on our website featuring videos and photo galleries showing these materials in use as well at smooth-on.com. And in terms of purchasing, the Compleat Sculptor has phenomenal materials in terms of the products that we're going to be showing here tonight. So feel free to check those out. And we may be putting, just so you know what to expect, we may be putting up some links on the screen too, and some reminders about the different materials that I'm working with tonight. Okay, so as far as the questions, we are going to answer questions a little bit later, but feel free to enter them in at the chat at any time. But I have one for you that hopefully is an easy one. I was wondering, how many of you have sculpted before? How many sculptors do we have here in the class tonight? From all over, it sounds like, from Maine to Texas. Thank you guys so much for coming out from wherever you are. Really appreciate that you're here. So for those of you who are sculptors, fantastic. I hope that there's some techniques here that you can take away for your own projects. But if you are not a sculptor, don't worry. These materials can be used and are very easy to use in a lot of different ways. We're going to show some of those examples. In general, in just broad strokes, they're phenomenal adhesives with a lot of different mixed materials and media, and they also make phenomenal support shells. So you're going to see some examples that might help you move your projects forward or inspire you to do new projects. But I do want to talk a little bit about some of the basics and foundations of sculpture, because we're going to be doing a lot of shaping tonight, and examples that were shaped by hand you're going to be seeing more of. So in general, when you're talking about sculpture, which is a big umbrella term that encompasses many different techniques and scales and materials, most commonly, and two main ways people work is with additive sculpture, where they're building up material onto a model and an armature to create their form. They might actually be taking some clay, or in this case, we're going to talk about the putties, pressing it onto the piece and building it up until they get that end result, that end surface detail that they're looking for. Another way that people work is a subtractive method. So when you're talking about subtractive sculpture, you're talking about carving away or cutting away from the existing material. You might be familiar with it from wood carving or chiseling marble. I can tell you, when I first learned subtractive sculpture, my teacher started me out with butter, which was a lot softer, and then worked up to soapstone, and then worked up to marble, so softer to harder materials. With these materials that we're going to talk about, the epoxy putties, you can work in an additive process, and when they're fully cured, you can work in a subtractive process and carve them away as well with sharp edge tools or rotary tools. There are some materials that are better suited for that we're going to go over in a little bit. But because they go from a putty-like consistency to a rigid material at room temperature, you have a lot of freedom in terms of how you want to work, either additive or subtractive. Now, I do want to talk about armatures. You might have heard this term before. You might have seen armature wire at your local art material store. And there's a lot of different ways that people build up material on top of substrates. So when it comes to armatures, they do a few different things. One thing they do, like you see here, this was actually made with the armature wire. We were just looking at this guy a moment ago. It holds your pose and lets you shape your form. Now you can see this is very flexible, which lets me bend and shape the pose that I want, which is great when I'm looking to form my pose and gesture, but it works against me when I add material onto it. So the examples that you see here on the table are made with the Freeform Air and Freeform Sculpt epoxy putties. This armature already has the Freeform Air epoxy putty on top of the underlying structure so that it's rigid. This isn't going anywhere. And it's ready for me either to add a non-drying oil-based clay onto if I wanted to use a material that doesn't harden over time, or if I wanted to, I could continue to work with the epoxy putties and build it up in more and more layers of detail, like some of the examples that you see on the table. Now, I want to tell you a tip and technique here in terms of the armatures for sculpting with the epoxy putties. Generally, I prefer to work in layers that give me a little bit of flexibility in my my pose. So when your armature is formed, it does two things. It holds your pose and it also generates mass. Now, with the epoxy putties, if you build up more mass in your armature using, in this case, this is aluminum foil. In some places, I secured it with hot glue. Very easy to do, very inexpensive, but it lets me control the thickness of my armature. So I could do this with aluminum foil, press it on top, and do a combined process. But what I like about it is by filling in my mass with an inexpensive substrate that I have control over, I can actually use that thickness to control how thick my outer surface is. Ultimately, when it comes to your sculpture, what you're going to see is the outside of the piece. And this gives me some freedom to actually go back, change my poses, break pieces. So in this case, this has actually been broken, reposed, seamed, and more muscle mass has been built up. Before I move on and stop talking about mass, what I want to show you is a comparison of what I mean about building up in layers. So this armature, right, that's maquette that's been started, is thicker and has greater mass than this thinner one here that you see. And that means that if I over add material in multiple batches, I have less to carve away or cut away. Something to think about when you're working in layers is knowing where your thinnest section is in your piece and your thickest section so that you can work up to that and save yourself some time and effort when it's in its flexible and putty state before it becomes firmer and is more challenging to carve. Now, this material that we're talking about and looking at in these examples are freeform air. It's extraordinarily lightweight, which helps reduce the weight that's on your armature and structure, and you can build right on top of it with the freeform sculpt to create more detail. Now, we're going to see more examples of the freeform sculpt later, but just to give you an idea of what you're looking at, the freeform air is the material that you see here that's a very light gray, and the darker gray, the more neutral gray, is the freeform sculpt. This one, let me see, there we go. So there's no confusion. This is freeform sculpt, and this is freeform air. I'm gonna show you another comparison. When I said it's lightweight and low density, it is extremely lightweight and low density, so much so, since you guys can't feel it there at home, I have an example here to be able to show you. So the freeform air, which you saw on the armatures we were just talking about, is so lightweight, it even floats on water. And that can allow you to create some very dynamic, rigid forms and reduce the overall weight of your piece. Now, the freeform sculpt, it's firmer, it captures more detail, and it's also much denser. So I'm going to drop the same amount there, and you can see that sinks right down to the bottom. So in terms of working with these two materials, you can work with them in layers. They're very adhesive to each other. I will say, for those of you who prefer subtractive sculpture, that the freeform air, being a little softer, it's a 50D hardness in terms of durometer, makes it a little easier to cut into and carve, as opposed to the freeform sculpt, which is much firmer. You're looking into that 80 D durometer range.
Janessa?
All right.
Can I interrupt for just one quick second? So, one of the things you mentioned was that you can build the freeform armature and then the freeform sculpt on top, but you could also just use the freeform air armature and then put plastiline on top of that, right?
Right. So I have an oil-based clay right here, and I can use this as a framework now that can better support the weight of my clay, and just in an additive form, go ahead and add material right on top of it. And because the clay, so normally where the question is, can you use a plastiline or a clay right on top of the cured freeform air? And I did mention that earlier, and yes, you can. The advantage here is that because the clay is very soft, if you had too much weight in your clay piece, gravity would act on it and it would buckle or bend under the strain. But because you have a rigid armature underneath, you don't have to worry about that flexibility happening under the weight of the clay. And it happens at room temperature. So you can use some extraordinarily inexpensive, easy to obtain substrates. Now, the materials I'm going to show you here, the freeform air, for example, even works on top of like an EPS foam. I do have an example I was going to show a little later on, but just to give you an idea, there is foam going all the way through this piece, and then the freeform air is added in a controlled thickness on the outside. Because when you are looking at a sculpture, what you're seeing is a texture and detail and controlled shaping on the outside of the material. And that's where you can use paper, foams, armature wire, a lot of different materials that you feel comfortable with as your substrate. And because this isn't solid, this is just a thin section of material. Once this is rigid, when I go to put more material on, I'm not going to, okay, so you can see it's a very thin thickness of material, and then the rest is just a styrofoam. I'm not going to break through this rigid material, so I now have a hard surface that I can build up on. And that's one of the things I mean about sculpting in layers. So as far as some of these basics about adding clay and material, some of the more commonly used techniques for sculpture, does anyone have any questions at this time before I start mixing material and showing you it in action? All right, great. Well, if we don't have any additional questions right now, we're going to move on, and I'm going to show you a little bit about the freeform air. We have quite a few freeform air products. The fastest setting one is our freeform air fast. I want to let you know these materials are mass sensitive. So before I mix anything, I'm putting on my gloves, right? That personal safety we were talking about before, because these are epoxy systems. And for those of you that tuned in later, I want to let you know I'm working in a well-ventilated space. But we're going to mix smaller batches of material. One, because I'm mixing them by hand, right? I don't want to mix more material than I can handle or manipulate. Two, the greater the mass, like we were talking about when I just dropped this example in the water, so it's still a little bit wet. This is a larger thickness. This is a greater mass example. When you reduce that mass and you do a thinner, smaller section, that is actually going to cure, here we go. That is going to have a longer pot life and a longer cure time, so you have more time to shape it and work with it. So the one we're going to start with right now, though, is the fastest setting option. Because as we work with it, we're going to actually see this cure in front of us at room temperature. I'm going to take my part A and part B. So these are two component systems, and I've dispensed them out by volume. So they're 1-to-1 by volume. So I have a ball in the same visual amount of part A and a ball in the same visual amount of part B. I'm going to put these together, and once I do, I have started the pot life for this material. So I'm going to work quickly to mix this material. And what I'm looking for is a complete mix. I don't want to see any striations. I want to see a uniform gray, and then I will know that this material is fully mixed, because you have those nice color indicators with the material to see that you have one uniform color and mix. Now, if I have this in a mass, of a 1/2 inch thickness, I'm only going to have 6 minutes to work with it. So this is fantastic for adhering or seaming parts. Like you saw in this earlier example where I've seamed and connected sections, I can do that very rapidly. I can also build on musculature onto my armature to give myself a surface to work in and move much quicker from one step to the next because I'm waiting a shorter duration of time for this material to go from this very soft state to that fully rigid one that you saw before. For me, I love freeform air. It feels a little bit like sculpting marshmallow without the stickiness. It's extremely lightweight, which reduces hand strain when I'm mixing it. As you saw, it mixed very easily and very quickly. I'm going to set this down just a moment and pull out a 3D printed example. Now I am going to change my gloves because I don't want any of that extra material that was sticking to my hands to get on this part we're going to repair. And sometimes, I don't know how many of you work with 3D printers. Sometimes when you have a part, it might end early for a variety of reasons. This, for example, was a print that was stopped too soon, and we were able to get another part to fit on top. But if I tried a standard adhesive, I wouldn't be able to fill in these infills that you see here. Now, again, I don't have much time to work with this. I'm going to spread my mass out a little bit thinner so I have more working time. Let me see. Well, I'll just go ahead and set that there. And in terms of tools, I really like tools that are very easy to use and disposable when I'm working with these materials because they're very adhesive, so that I don't have to worry about it sticking to my tool. So I'm just taking some of the freeform air and I'm just pushing it into these infills on this pauldron. I'm going to work real quick. So this material is going to start to firm up on us very rapidly, like we were talking about. But this will give me a starting point to be able to adhere these two sections together. Now, if I don't want it sticking to my gloves, I actually can use an isopropyl alcohol and to help smooth the surface. But for right now, I'm not touching any of the epoxy. I'm just touching the 3D print and pushing them together. Look how easy that adhered. So I'm just closing off that seam, and then I'm going to take a nice disposable tool. So you can see a little bit where the excess material pushed out, but you can see that's very well contacted there. Now, both isopropyl alcohol and our freeform detailer product work really nicely to help smooth the material. I'm actually going to use a little bit of the freeform detailer to smooth it out. But before I do that, I'm just going to take a clean, disposable mixing stick and make myself a sharp-edged tool by breaking it in half. And I'm just going to scrape away some of that freeform air excess that we don't need. So that I have just a very thin line visible. And I'm not worried about the material showing this white line where I've adhered it, because I can go in and paint it later, or I can coat this with a 3D print coating like our Smooth-On's XTC 3D. But what I want to make sure doesn't happen is I don't want any gaps. I want to make sure that, and I'm even going to go in, so it doesn't look like I really need to smooth anything out too much, but I can just with hand pressure go in and fill in anywhere that line isn't completely closed off. And if I was missing, if I had a big void in the print, I could actually go in and add material and resculpt that up, or even sculpt additional detailing onto it. So this will let me save castings or save prints that normally would have been a huge waste of either time or materials and might have been discarded. Otherwise, I can go in and I can, this is that freeform detailer I was telling you about, just lightly applying some and scraping away the excess. So I did tell you we have several different freeform air materials. Freeform air is the epoxy putty you're watching right now. This one is specifically the freeform air fast, the most rapid setting one. As we're working, you're going to see this is going to start to firm up on us. If you needed more time to work with your piece, we do have our freeform air, which has a longer pot life and cure time. We have a high temperature option and flame rated option, and they all have different advantages and different properties. So that's nice and repaired. I don't have any areas there that I'm not worried about sanding off. You can see that nice clean line. So even though it doesn't have as high detail as some of our other epoxy putties, because it's lower density, it still captures really excellent detail and can fill in these real small sections. So I'm just scraping out the excess on the inside so that all the way around we have a piece that's ready to go. In fact, like that horn that you saw earlier, sometimes these materials are great for applications where you may be looking at creating a cosplay example where you might want something that's extremely lightweight. What I will say is that these materials are rigid, so they're not going to be as impact resistant as some other options that you may choose depending on your project needs. So I'm going to set this off to the side. We'll check this in a little bit and let that cure up. And the material itself, I can use this extra to see if it's fully cured before I handle the other example. This is a great tip to keep a little bit of excess material off to the side. This way you don't handle a part you've put a lot of work into finessing and then disrupting all that work because you're excited to check it out before it's cured. You can actually keep a test sample just like you keep a test cup next to your work area for mold making and casting. And the material is going to get warmer. As I was saying, if you wanted more time to work with it, you wouldn't keep it in a ball like this. Coming from a sculpting tradition, I'm used to people tell you to ball up your material and put it on the side. You don't want to do that with the epoxy putties. If you keep it thin, you have more time to work with it and reduce that mass than if you keep it in a more significant thickness or a greater mass. So I'll just actually set that right there. So that's our freeform air fast. Now the freeform air, as I was telling you, has a longer pot life and cure time. We're going to mix up a little bit of that right now. And I'm going to show you a really neat trick. So the freeform air, if you prefer having more time to work, this is where we're talking about scale. In these small examples, it's very easy to take one batch, mix your part A and part B. And in this material, I'm going to have a lot more time for it to stay in this putty state before it becomes firm at room temperature. And that's great if I'm doing something extremely large. Let's say I have a foam piece and I'm using this as a coating where I'm shaping detail into it or even pressing textures into it. Speaking of which, I was telling you the level of detail that this can capture is pretty exceptional. Show you an example of that really quick. So that's fully mixed, just like the freeform air fast. It's 1:1 by volume. And even though it's very adhesive, it didn't want to stick to that board, right? So here's one of those great tips for working with them. I'm going to take a little bit of water and use this as a bonding primer. I'm just going to wet my surface. And now when I press my freeform air against it, it's going to stick really nicely on that surface. Now, the freeform air does actually like being smoothed with water. I can go ahead and smooth that surface. I can also use isopropyl alcohol or freeform detailer to keep it from sticking to my tools or textures. I've got this piece of aluminum foil right here. So I'm just going to go ahead and spray that detailer and just press into it. And I can sculpt texture very quickly or draw lines and work into the material and create my own texture or shape. And you can see it's very soft and easy to work with right now. In a little while, it's going to be completely rigid. I'm checking out that material we mixed before to see if it's set up. So the freeform air, longer pot life and cure time, the freeform air faster pot life and cure time. You can actually combine the two, which is phenomenal if you're trying to dial in your working time in your environment and your project needs. So I have a little more freeform air fast. So this is like that first material that we mixed. This is the rapid setting one. That part A and part B is mixing together. So I get a full cure. Or a complete mix so that it cures completely for me. One-to-one by volume. So as you saw, I didn't need to mix by weight. I'm not using any additional tools. I'm just dispensing out as much as I need of the same visual amount of part A and the same visual amount of part B. We've got this ball, right, of the mixed material, the freeform air fast. So this piece that we just created, as beautiful as it was, it's still in its pot life. It's still very easy to work with. I'm going to take about half of it. I'm going to let this one cure over here. This is the really fast one. We'll let that one cure over here. And then I'm going to have the same visual amount of that part A and part B of the fast and the regular. I can mix those together. And now I have something that's going to cure right in the middle. So I can customize a material to my hand time, my tools in my environment. And actually, I can even use that custom material between those two pot lives and cure times. We'll put that, let's make 3 balls that are all similar. We're going to come back and look at these later and see which one's still workable for us and which one is cured. These are small balls, so even though they're a greater mass than if we left them thinner, they're all real similar in terms of how those are going to be affected by the environment. And we can use this material to make a repair, to build up, more muscle on one of our pieces. And as I was saying, there's a great example of that bonding primer. Just wet that surface, makes it very easy to stick. And what's cool about this is by applying it onto my armature, that is not going to move now, where I can bend and pose the other parts of it. Okay, so for those of you who are not sculptors in the room, my favorite thing to use freeform air for is support shells. It allows you in your mold making to create very lightweight support shells that are easy to handle and shape on top of your mold. So that if you, for example, this is a mask. This is a casting that came out of this mold. If I had to rotationally make a casting by slushing or brushing material up on the sides over and over. If this was made with a plaster or a heavier material, it would get extraordinarily heavy. This is very lightweight, so it means I have less strain when I'm applying material into it. And if I wanted to, I could take some of this freeform air and build up feet and level it out to be able to rest it on my surface or add supports to it. Freeform air actually can be used too behind a detail coat. So this is our epoxy coat red. Just like a moment ago you saw the epoxy coat gray. To capture the detail out of that mold surface, you can brush it in and get a thin layer. And then you can back it with the freeform air to create a controlled thickness so that you can have a piece that has the thickness that you shaped with the air that might be very lightweight, but still have all that very fine detail with an alternative epoxy coating. So we have a few different epoxy products here from Smooth On. Some of them can be cast, like our Epoxy Cast series. Some of them can be brushed onto a surface as a coating, like the XCC 3D we were talking about, or the epoxy coat, which can go into a mold. That was a silicone mold that I just showed you. And then we have a product called Epoxymite. Now, I don't know if any of you have made a fiberglass support shell before. This is something that you can actually do by laminating layer after layer of fiberglass to create a part that's very thin and very strong. If you're going to do this and create a thickness, this is 5 pieces of glass, and you can see that's a very thin part. I'm trying to help show the camera there. It would take you a very long time if you wanted your part to be thicker. And this is called filleting. Freeform air can actually be used with these materials to create that thickness and still get the benefit and strength of that fiberglass and still get the detail of the epoxy coat. If you wanted to make a rigid mold this way, you could do this. If you were making a very large tool that was strong and lightweight, you can incorporate the freeform air to do this as well. This is called filleting, and it's very popular for composite parts also. So we talked about freeform air in the series as an adhesive, as a filleting material, as a support shell, and for shaping, whether it ends up being your final result or if it ends up being just a component in your sculpting workflow. And that is all I'm going to say about the freeform air at the moment, but I am going to show you some examples of our freeform sculpt and even how it works with the freeform air moving forward. So we have a moment for some questions here too, because I'm going to move another table over. If anybody has some questions about anything I've just demonstrated that they would like to know more about, that's something that I can answer at this time. Okay. I'm going to duck out of the screen just a moment while I move a table over. Pardon me. Oh, you guys are the best. Thanks for being so patient. All right. Oh, actually want this a little closer. Yeah, thank you. Because, oh, there we go. All right. So I also have that little bit of freeform air we mixed up so that we can see when this is ready to demold. So if you happen to get epoxy materials on your hands when you're working, I do want to let you know we have a product that can help with that too. It's our epoxy cleaner. I have an example of it here just in case we needed it while we were working to help remove material, epoxy materials from hands that Smooth On offers. And we're going to move on, and I'm going to show you the freeform sculpt. Now, the freeform sculpt, like I was talking about with the freeform air, has a part A and a part B. It's a 2-component system. This is that higher density material we were talking about that has more detail. And just like the freeform air, I'm going to take that part A and that part B, and I'm going to mix them together. So I'm going to mix these 2-component systems together and knead vigorously. This is also, I found it to be more adhesive than the freeform air product. So this is the freeform sculpt that we're mixing right now. And when it mixes together, it reminds me a lot of an oil clay or a water clay that's very soft and very flexible. In fact, it can actually be extruded through an extruding tool when it's fully mixed. And when we have this mixed up, I'm going to show you how you can use the UVO colorants as well to mix different colors into the material. So I'm combining that part A and part B. Sometimes I find it's actually easy to elongate it and then put it together to help that mix more thoroughly. And when it's newly mixed, it's at its softest. So if you're going to use this as an adhesive or spread it over a surface, I can tell you it's at its softest when it's initially combined. I like to say it's a little bit like shaping with time, because as you move through the pot life of the freeform sculpt, it's going to get firmer. And I even have an example of that. We'll see in a moment as far as how it cures. Now I have that really soft clay-like material, the freeform sculpt. And I do have it sticking to my gloves. That's why we wear gloves, so it's not sticking to our hands, because the material is very adhesive. And once it's cured, this is actually a material you can use as well to make molds and castings. I have an example here of a relief piece that was made with fully cured freeform sculpt. So there we go. There's that really nice clay-like epoxy putty. All right, I'm going to change my gloves a second and show you how beautifully this captures detail. All right. So I brought some tools over. Sorry to jump off screen for you guys. But one of the things I wanted to show you is that to break up that adhesion to my tools with a material that naturally wants to be adhesive, I can use that freeform detailer to spray the surface and then press my texture into it. So even though this is just a very fragile piece of paper, you can see now I have a texture from where I press that against the surface without it sticking at all to the paper itself. So if you wanted to create a texture effect like pores or wrinkles, you can actually do that even with fabric and paper. So another little tip there. I find this is a helpful processing tip too, that for some people, this is going to be a little too soft when it's initially mixed. You can always wait for this to get firmer into its pot life, mix it, and come back to it, I'll use very small cups and just write the time when I mixed it. Then I can use that, throw the material in there and use that as a reference for how long into the pot life I am when I go to sculpt with it, to find that moment where that sort of sweet spot where you like to work with it with your hands and techniques for the best outcome for what you're looking for. Sometimes as well, if I find that I don't want to take that extra time or I don't have that time, I'll take a sulfur-free clay and 1-to-1 by volume, we'll mix that in as a filler with the freeform sculpt. The sulfur-free clay I'm using right now is called Sculptex, and I'm just using it to bring that freeform sculpt to a working consistency that's a little firmer, while still allowing me to preserve that working time. And I'll show you an example of why I just did that with this newly mixed material. This is an advanced technique. And I can tell you that if you have any doubt about whether or not your clay is going to work in this way, I recommend doing a small scale test. There are many different materials out there that work in many different ways. But I'm using an oil-based clay as a filler and making sure it's fully mixed in to my already mixed freeform sculpt, so that I have a material that's stiffer right off the bat. I'm just going to mix just a little bit more. Thank you guys for being so patient while I'm mixing these materials. And I'm looking to make sure that none of that clay is exposed, that all I see is that uniform consistency. Now, I lose a little bit of elongation on the material, but this lets me have something that right off the bat is firmer. We'll go ahead and take a little bit of this freeform sculpt we mixed up. Then the newly mixed sculpt, which might more readily, ooh, this one's holding its form nicely, because it's softer, succumb to gravity. Because of how soft it is, a little easier. But both, as you can see, I use this as a slump test to see where in the pot life the workability of the material is. So just a helpful advanced tip that it may be possible to utilize a sulfur-free clay as a filler, but I can tell you that it is the easiest when the material is at its softest to add color. So let's add a little bit of color to our freeform sculpt. And the color that we're going to add right now, which I just dropped, sorry about that, is our UVO black. I'm not worried about overloading the system with this, but I do need to wear gloves because, as you can see, adding color is a really messy process. But once it's worked into the material, it's going to have some really beautiful pigmentation. And the coolest part of this, which I'm going to show you in a cured example, is that the color goes all the way through. Unlike a paint effect, this color is consistent all throughout the material. If you're doing jewelry applications or carving applications where you're cutting into it, you'll have that consistent color all throughout. So I have that black color right there. I'm going to go ahead and change my gloves real quick. And show you a little bit about what I was talking about in terms of that color going all the way through. So this is a pigmented freeform sculpt example, and you can see it was cut in half. And you can see those beautiful layers of color all throughout the piece. As I continue to cut it, it'll reveal more and more color with that material. And I can always add layers up. I did that in this piece to use it as an indicator of thickness. So when I cut into it, I know the depth to which I've cut in to each layer. So if I took a rotary tool and I carved into this, I can work down through the yellow layer, down to the red, down to the blue, and I know that I haven't exceeded the thickness that I want to use. So the color doesn't just have to be decorative, it can help you functionally control the thickness of your outcome as well. So the freeform sculpt, as I was saying, can also be used to customize pieces or make molds. This was a very inexpensive ceramic tile that the freeform sculpt was added up on top of to turn it into a relief piece that was then molded with our Mold Star series. I'm gonna hold that up for you there. To create a range of different casting effects. So I can use that material and mixed media and its adhesive properties to create a master that I can then take to that next level for mold making and casting as well. So that's a smaller example. This is a larger one where you can see that detail where layers of freeform sculpt are built up to reach higher relief as opposed to very low relief. And I'm going to show you just a quick tip in terms of how I work with the freeform sculpt that might help you if you're a decorative or relief artist. Reference material is always very important when you're sculpting. In this case, I found sometimes it's helpful to actually keep my reference in a clear surface so that I can get my proportions and shape with the adhesive freeform sculpt on top of it. So I'm still building up in layers, just like the relief that you saw before, as opposed to a dimensional piece like the initial sculptures we were talking about. And I can use this to make a mold from and cast into, or if I'm just creating one, I've now enhanced that original. But this is a nice way I've found to be able to sculpt directly on the reference and not have it stick to it so that I can move it back and forth to see where I want to add detail. So that was all I was going to show you with the freeform sculpt right now. We're at the end of the first section of our presentation. If there are any questions that have come up throughout, I'd be happy to answer them at this time. If not, I can actually show you one surprising feature of the freeform sculpt I've been really excited about lately too. So we're going to open up to the questions at the moment. If anybody has any questions for us, either that they want to ask or put in through the chat.
So someone said that you mentioned it to use it to making a mold. And you can, you know, for the freeform air, you can also use it for mentioning, you mentioned that you could use it for making a negative representation of a piece that you could then cast into.
Okay, so the question is, can I use the freeform air and freeform sculpt to make a negative that I could then cast into? Yes, however, what I will say about that is that when you press the freeform air or freeform sculpt into a surface, and you can press them into molds, you can lose detail in the application process, where if you brush on the epoxy coat product, that will allow you to capture more detail from your mold surface. So I would recommend an epoxy coat material as your detailed surface if you're trying to maximize as much detail as possible. If you don't mind your part being a little rougher, then yes, you can. This is actually freeform air that was pressed into this Equinox mold. And you can do that. You want to be aware of your sealing agents and release agents to make sure they're appropriate for the type of mold that you're using. In this case, this is a platinum silicone system, and the epoxy is not as adhesive to that surface, so I didn't require a release agent in this case. With what you're talking about, I do want to point out these materials are rigid. If you're making a rigid mold of a rigid model, that can be extremely challenging and have a high potential for a mechanical lock. So these are reasons why you may prefer to use a flexible rubber in that particular case, and one that's compatible with the materials we're talking about. You might even find you may need to seal that and apply a release agent depending on the nature of your application. Does that help answer your question? Okay.
So, just to clarify, so for making a mold in an epoxy hard mold, the best thing to do would be to use a skin coat that's a more liquid epoxy, so you get a better surface structure from that, and then back it up with freeform. But the freeform could be used if you were applying putty, but anytime you're applying a putty, you run the risk of having gaps and things like that as you're applying. So in terms of the mold. The other
Correct. So the question is for clarification, would I recommend using a more liquid epoxy for that? Yes, in this case, I was recommending an epoxy that is a coating that you can brush on as opposed to one that you pour. That's an option too. Some people use either to make rigid molds.
Sure.
In this case, I'd say if you're going to do that as well and you want a thinner rigid mold, I also recommend keeping in mind that epoxamite material to add strength. So that freeform air earlier, that when I was telling you that it's brittle and you might want to add strength with the epoxamite, one of the things people ask me a lot is, can they break the example? So I made a small piece of freeform air for you to show you. Yes, it will break or snap without additional support or reinforcement. If you dropped a rigid mold or support shell on the hard floor and there's no additional support there, then yes, it could break depending on the thickness of your part. There's a lot of different variables there. And that's where I was letting you know the epoxamite is compatible with it to add strength, and the epoxy coat is compatible with it to capture more detail out of the surface of your mold.
Also, two other quick questions for you that we've had directions on. One was to get the freeform air that you put onto the plexiglass, did you apply a release to that so you could pop it off onto the plexiglass frame, you know, when you built over the picture?
So the question is, can I get it to release from the plexi frame? I can, but it's adhesive to the frame. So right now, if it released, so that was regarding this example, if it released, it would fall right off the surface. So in this particular case, I want it to be adhesive to the surface. If I prepared it with a release agent, I wouldn't want it to be on a slope like this. I'd want it to be flat so that it was secured, so that the act of making a mold didn't displace the original.
Or you could actually use it as a finished product and it would just be removable from the base.
Right. So if I wanted to use it as a final project, and that was something, so it's very common where you're just customizing one or two examples, I'd really want to be aware of what that substrate is that I'm applying it to. I might even need to test a few release agents to find a suitable combination, like the Ease Release 205 or Sonite Wax. It's just if your surface is too released, you might find it difficult to actually work on top of it. So you may be breaking off your part and then transferring it to another surface and using additional material as an adhesive to mount it down. It's definitely an option.
Well, what's awesome is then you get to use more freeform air to fix it.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question for me, please?
I said, then you get to use more freeform air to fix it.
Yes, you can always add, the question is, can I use more freeform air to fix it? I can use freeform air to bond onto itself to make repairs. That's actually why I really like the aluminum foil armatures. They're very easy to break. I don't have to worry about cutting an armature wire or putting more strain on my piece. Very easy to snap, repose, add more material, and reposition and move forward.
The last question we got was also that they asked if, as using an oil-based filler, how does that affect the cure time and hardness of the finished product?
Okay, so we had a question about color. I'm so glad you asked. So the UVO colorant to the material doesn't affect the hardness. I do find that the colorant may soften the material a little bit when you're initially handling it. So those examples that we were talking about, watching that material cure, I want to show you a trick. Right? We're talking about advanced tips and techniques for working with these materials. Sometimes I use gravity to my advantage. In this particular case, these pieces are freeform sculpt that have been colored. I actually divided it into two batches, just like I have the gray and the black. I could mix material and then color two separate parts and then swirl them together. Now these are fully cured. These have had plenty of time to set up, but I didn't want them to slump while they were actually very, very soft and newly mixed, or soft when I added the colorant to it. So I just set it up on two surfaces and let them cure on a vertical. If I choose to, further on in that pot life, so I actually made these just a few hours ago, and while they had a little bit of flex to them, I took that extra step and made horns or teeth, depending what you're looking to do. But the nice thing about that color mix is you can see the motion of my hands working with that material to create those swirls. So this is the same material, Same type of colorant. The difference is that I let one completely go from a liquid to a solid inverted. One, I started that way, and then later into its pot life before it fully cured, I bent and formed the materials into controlled shapes.
Very cool.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's actually a really, really nice way to, make icicles or stalactites. Basically, you're capturing a record of your manipulation of the material, depending how you let that set up. And I've actually found as well, something you can do beyond just the colorants is you can actually add metal powder. Now, in this case, this example is made with the bronze powder into the freeform air and freeform sculpt materials to create a casting out of actual metal powder and epoxy putty. Well, I apologize. It's not a casting. It's not a cold casting. It was made with layers of material that actually had the powder mixed in, and then polishes and patinas like metal in an original that was made at room temperature. So what you're looking at here is the freeform air fast with metal powder worked into the epoxy putty just like the colorant we worked in, and then allowed to cure and sculpted in layers. So there's a lot of versatility with smooth on materials that can let you achieve some really incredible effects with these putties. All right, with that, I think if there are no other questions, we're going to take a break. Is there anything else anybody would like to know before we step away for the moment?
There don't seem to be anything in the text questions. Is everybody doing okay? Keeping up? Excellent. I see a lot of thumbs up.
All right. I'm seeing a lot of thumbs up. Thank you, guys.
Awesome. And then while you're taking a break, the other thing about this that's kind of interesting with the metal powders that Janessa just mentioned is that all those are buffable. So once you impregnate them into the material, what you want to do is then buff the surface, because that exposes the metal and removes some of the resin from the surface. And that's what gives you that metallic sheen, right? Because otherwise it just looks like brown plastic when you first mix it. But you can buff it out. And then what's also interesting is that even when you're adding real metal powders like this to the mixes, you can then add cold patinas, even acid patinas to it. And those will change the surface, creating a more oxidized and antique looking finish, even on these foam materials. It's also great for patching bronzes. Like if you ever have a bronze that's damaged and you don't want to go back and do a welding job, you can typically match colors and patch, faulty castings and things like that. So there's all kinds of options with these materials that are really cool.
And I want to clarify, I don't have any patina examples with these metal powders with the epoxy putty, because the epoxy putty as well is going to add some coloration to the material itself. But I do have an example about what was just mentioned, that this example, it's just some really rough material, has no sheen to it. Where this one that's been detailed, I've actually abraded the surface with a steel wool to expose that metal powder behind it, so that if I was going to do any tests with any of the patina processes, that would be something that I would do. But I always recommend a test piece to help visualize that depending on the needs of your project. But you are going to have an inherent coloration from the putty. As you saw, the freeform sculpt is gray in appearance. The freeform air is a very light gray in appearance. They can be painted with acrylics. So the example that you see here was actually painted. There's some great videos on our website on smooth-on.com that you can actually see the painting process in action. And I wanted to show you that that's bonded right on and was sculpted right on to the base. So in terms of depending your project needs, this is one that can be exhibited on a vertical without worrying that it's going to distort or come off that surface, because the materials are so adhesive. But it didn't require primer. The paint could be directly applied to the material once it's cured. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and take a 5-minute break then, and we'll see you guys back in just a little bit. Thank you so much for staying with us.
If you want to highlight me now. Hi, we're back here again in TCS too, so we have multi-locations. While she's taking a break, if you guys don't need to or have any questions, I'm here to help as well. So you get to see me in my Hugh Hefner outfit. right? I decided that pajamas and a neck brace are the way to go. It's very COVID chic. Hope you guys are having a good time, and if you have any questions at this time, I'm here to say hi and help too. Or you can all just take a 5-minute break. That's okay too.
Hey, I have a question real quick. Hi.
Hi.
I'm in Santa Fe, for whatever that's worth. I was just wondering, like, so there's certain densities of this air, of the free form, and I just wondered if one is, so does, say if there's more air in it, is that going to make it, like, say if you're adhering like a rock to, I don't know what the heck, a piece of glass or something?
Sure. Well, are you asking about the adhesive properties or the densities or the strength?
That's a really good question. If the freeform air has a very high level of a specialized lightweight filler in it, versus something like freeform sculpt, which has a high level of filler, but it's denser filler. Okay. Versus something that would be like an epoxy adhesive on its own, like our say MT13, which is like an epoxy you would get from like a hardware store. I would think that, you know, when you talk about adhesive properties, the more filler there is, the like less epoxy on the surface there will be. That being said, many of our customers, and I'm at Smooth On in my office, many of our customers in the theming industry and like theme parks and aquariums and stuff like that use a material we make called Habitat, which is also an epoxy putty, but it's more of like a paste. It doesn't have that filler in it.
Okay.
Right? It's more like a paste that you would add. We have a specialized filler you can add it to kind of to taste.
Yeah.
You can add the filler. So a lot of people will actually use the Habitat and add just a small amount of filler and use that as an adhesive.
Okay. I'm used to using, what is it called? It's Magic Sculpt.
Yeah.
It might be the same, similar. I don't know.
So all of these types of epoxy putties are revolving around the same type of chemistry. Right? And they have slightly different properties. Some of them are a little stickier, some of them are a little stronger, some are a little faster, some are a little longer working time, some are lighter weight. Like the freeform air is a very, very particular product that's individual unto itself like nothing else. So Magic Sculpt is a very good product to use, and freeform sculpt is going to be very similar to that.
Correct. It's going to be the same type of feel.
Okay. I just didn't.
For adherence to glass and a lot of these materials that you're talking about, one of the other things you want to factor into it is that having a little bit of tooth on the surface really increases your adhesive grab. So when you have a very slick surface, regardless of what that material is, it's more likely to have a delamination point than if you actually have some tooth to it. So with a glass piece, you actually want to hit it with like a diamond sandpaper or a rasp first, just to give you a little bit of tooth first. And then the same thing for the stone. A smooth stone obviously is going to have a much more glassier surface. It's more likely to release from that. So you can get a better physical bond in addition to the chemical bond when you have more tooth to the surface that you're bonding.
Yeah, you want to get every advantage you can when you're trying to adhere something. I mean, people will also adhere metals, and in that case, you'll want to chemically etch it as well as abrade it, so that you've got any oils or anything off of the surface. So. All epoxies are very adhesive by nature. Yeah.
Okay.
Depending on the surface that you need to apply, if you need a really, really tight surface, a liquid epoxy is going to give you a better bond because it fills those gaps better than a putty. Even if you're spreading it and pressing it, you still don't get quite the same bond with that. That doesn't mean that they're no good, but sometimes you get a better bond from a liquid. And actually, Smooth On makes a product called EA40, which is an awesome epoxy.
Yeah, the EA40 is kind of it's like a laminating epoxy, but it's a little bit thicker. It's a little bit, that's a great material. I do like that. Yeah.
I'm always like right here, like I'm attaching this alabaster to this rock and trying to, I mean, it's ridiculous the shit I do.
Well, Yeah, the good thing is you have two porous substrates there. Obviously some are micropores. But the more fluid that you can get the epoxy, the more mechanical connection you'll have between those two porous surfaces, because it'll soak into the pores.
And I'm gonna have Morgan put a link to the EA40 in there too, so you can see that.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Of course, my pleasure.
I have a question.
Sure, I'm sorry, what's your name?
I'm sorry?
Who's speaking? It's hard.
I have the freeform detailer, and
Yeah.
it talks about this is part A. Is there a part B?
No.
I had a lot of problems with the stickiness of the freeform sculpt, and the stickiness drove me crazy. I just had
The yellow label is kind of a preset. This is Sparta label. There's no part B to that material. Generally, it was a solvent developed specifically for work with epoxy. I mean, you can use isopropyl. You can use water in some cases, depending on what you're doing. But really, of all of those, the detail is probably going to give you the best dissolution, the best dissolve ability, because it is a type of a solvent.
Mm-hmm. And what about the glove? What's your trick on the glove? It got so sticky, it would stick to the gloves. And
So Gina, one of the best things actually, since the way you're working with direct sculpture, is just keep a little cup of water there and put a little bit of water on your gloves. You don't need a lot. The water doesn't interfere with the material. If you put in too much, it gets a little slurry. So just a tiny little bit of water will act as a vehicle to just prevent it from sticking. The other thing is, when you're mixing larger batches, sometimes you've got more surface contact. So if you just try a little bit smaller batch at a time, it makes it more manageable. But a tiny little bit of water lets you just spread it out and move it and manipulate it almost more like clay. And that really works well for that. But not, just a little bit.
And as you know, it goes through kind of a phase.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's a really sticky phase, and then there's a phase where it's really nice to work with. If, as Mark said, you work with a little bit of water on your gloves to get over that sticky phase, then you'll get to that phase where it starts, it gets hot, warm, and then that's the point where it starts to get a little sticky. Yeah.
I would just be able to work with a certain amount of time, and then I have to stop and then wait and then make another batch.
You know what? You may need to just reduce the batch size. The nice thing about
it's small. I made that mistake right off the bat. No, they were small.
the benefits of epoxy is a lot of itself. So, you have a bathtub full.
I'm a metalsmith. I do smaller things. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Definitely.
Thanks, Jason.
That's what I'm here for.
Hi. That's what we're all here for. It's all fun and games.
I just want to let you guys know I think this class is awesome so far, and I'm really grateful for it.
Thank you so much.
It's a bargain.
Well, we try to keep things reasonable, but also interactive. And again, I like to keep the classes small enough so everybody can really get a taste for it. And we're going to try and have some other future ones that are going to be process oriented. So maybe that, we'll have a kit that goes along with it, and then everybody can do the same project as we go, or play with the materials in their hands while we're talking too, because I think that'll enhance this to another level. And when, right now we're in the break, but I would like you to keep in mind as you're viewing this and as we continue through it, I really want constructive criticism. Anything we can do to make it better and to make it more facile for you guys, because part of being a sculptor and working with these materials is the hands-on part, and not being able to do that in front of somebody makes it much more difficult. But if I can help to figure out those problems and fix them and make this better for everybody, I really would like both. I mean, obviously, we definitely want to know what's good. But if there's anything we can make better, we also want to know.
Right.
So far, it's awesome and super.
Thank you so much.
Hey, I have one more question, if we have time, about the Moldmax 30. She was talking about it being a platinum silicone. That was
Moldmax 30 is a tin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
and that's better for not adhesive. Is that what
either of the
she went?
silicones will work fine.
I'm sorry?
Either of the types of silicones have a natural release property for the epoxies, but for long-term usage, it's always better to put a release into it before you press the epoxy in.
Yeah. Yeah, any epoxy when it's fully cured is inert. So you can use a platinum silicone like Mold Star, which is our platinum 1-to-1 silicone, or you could use a tin cured silicone, which Mold Max 30 is. Mold Max 30 is a real workhorse. I mean, that material, if I'm making a mold of something and I really want to know that it's going to cure up and not have any inhibition worries, I'll go with a tin silicone like Mold Max 30. Now, over time, a tin silicone it's condensation cure. It cures with moisture. So over time, a mold will shrink a little bit more, and it doesn't have as long of a library life as a platinum silicone. It's a little less expensive, but a platinum silicone, even though it's the Ferrari of chemical formulas for silicone, it's a lot more sensitive. Certain oil-based clays, anything with sulfur in it, latex will cause a catastrophic inhibition. So just keep that in mind.
The other thing, what's nice is because I know some of you are doing small applications and jewelry things. The putties, there's some platinum putties and tin putties that are press-on silicones, and those are very easy to use right on the freeform as well, just to do reproduction. So now all of a sudden, if you want to make the original form, you can then cast it in resin or anything else that you want to after the fact as well.
Okay.
This is back. We're going to put it back on the highlight. Thank you. And
Gotcha.
we'll stay chimed in.
Hi. So I heard some really great questions during the break. I'm hoping everybody is back and ready to go. I just wanted to pick up a little bit. One of the reasons I was recommending disposable wood tools is because the wood itself absorbs water. So that water that smooths on the surface and breaks up adhesion on the Freeform Air and Freeform Sculpt works to your benefit when you use wood tools, because it helps keep your tools from sticking even more. And I do want to point out that the Freeform Detailer works really, really well to help keep it from sticking to your surfaces or your tools. You can always spray that on your surface just like you saw me do. I want to clear up one last thing, which is that I heard a question about tin silicones. I want you to know all the silicones I'm demonstrating today are platinum silicones. The one that I showed you of that mold was actually a Mold Star mold, or Mold Star 16, to show you that even a more sensitive platinum silicone system was able to cure against that epoxy material to make that mold. Now, again, if you have any doubts about how your mold rubber is going to work, I always recommend doing some small tests. But that example you saw before was from our Mold Star series, not our Mold Max series, which I realize there might be some confusion there because the names are similar. But we're going to talk about a few more silicone products, and I want you to know the ones I'm about to show you are all platinums. We're just staying with the platinum family right now. And to pick up, since we're back from the break, I want to show you that pauldron that we made. That's fully cured up. I could actually go ahead and wear that out, or for the rest of the presentation if I had straps on it. And those pieces that we mixed with the Freeform Air have already cured up, right? No bend, just breaking in those thin sections. But that material we mixed with the Freeform Air, not the Fast, but the Freeform Air, is still flexible, where the Freeform Air Fast is already fully cured up. So that's where I was saying the timing with it is something that you can control by using the right material for what you're looking to do. All right, that being said, did that help explain a little bit more some of the questions that happened during the break while we were away? And are we ready to move forward? All right, okay. So I heard a little bit of talk about our Freeform Habitat series of putties. And the Habitat materials are great for scaling up your project because they mix in 3-component systems, a little different than the 2-component systems we worked with the Freeform Air and the Freeform Sculpt. The Freeform Habitat actually has 3 parts. It has a part A, a part B, A, B, and a folding powder. So this is the folding powder that we have. I'm actually going to go ahead and pour some out. So the powder itself allows you to thicken the working viscosity of the Freeform Habitat products, which are much softer. Actually, I'll just move that off to the side than the materials you just saw me working with. So there's an A and a B that go together, and they go in the folding powder for mixing. You can go ahead and use some of those disposable tools we were talking about. And this is our Freeform Habitat FR, our fire safe. And it is also 1-to-1 by volume, just like the materials we were working with before. See how that is more trowelable and spreadable? I want that to be a little bit thicker for my shaping, but I'm going to visually dispense out 1-to-1 by volume my part A and my part B. So unlike what we were doing before, I'm not rolling these up into balls. I'm drawing them directly from the container, trying to get to that same visual amount of that A and of that B. So a little bit different. But this will allow me to mix larger quantities for pieces that are bigger. Actually, we'll put all three right up here. And then I'm going to take the folding powder and spread it on those materials so it doesn't stick to my gloves. And I'm just going to knead those together until they're completely mixed. So the folding powder is keeping that very adhesive epoxy putty, the Freeform Habitat,
I don't know.
from sticking to my hands. Did we have a question? Oh, I might have just heard something. If you do have a question, don't hesitate to put it in the chat. We'll make sure we get to the questions at the end. Now, what I'm looking for, just like before, is for these two, the part A and part B of this material, not to have any striations, to be one uniform mix.
There was a question about the amount of folding powder that should be used.
I think I heard a question, is there an amount of folding powder that I use? In the trial size unit, those are the containers that you see here that come with the material. I want to make sure that there's enough folding powder that I'm not like pressing through to the bottom, that I can cover my the batch that I'm mixing. Now, again, I tend not to mix larger than my hand size because, as you see, we're mixing it by hand. Now, if I spread that material out so that part is exposed that doesn't have the folding powder, you can see I have a uniform color there. I don't have any striations. I have a complete mix. It just has a coating of that folding powder on the top. And now it is a much higher mixed viscosity. It is much thicker than it was when I initially dispensed it out. And it's more dough-like, which is great for applying to my surfaces. So I'm going to make an example with this, and then I'm going to show you some cured examples made with these materials. There's just a little bit more folding powder. But as you can see, that's all one really nice uniform color, which means that I have a complete mix. I don't see any unmixed material revealed there when I spread out that folding powder. So I'm going to move that folding powder out of the way for the moment. I'm just going to spread this on the surface. Now, it is very adhesive, and you might see it sticking to my gloves a little bit in areas where that folding powder has been spread out. To keep that from happening, I can use an isopropyl alcohol and apply that to the surface. And I'm going to show you how we can use that silicone that doesn't want to stick to that material as a texture stamp. So I have a few texture stamps here, and we're going to talk about these in more detail after I show you a little bit how it works. Well, actually, you know what? I can do that without the gloves because I'm not going to touch the material. I'm just going to touch the stamp. I'm going to take some isopropyl alcohol, and I'm going to spray the habitat. And then using a silicone stamp, so this is Rebound 25, I'm going to press that into the surface. This This material is very popular for habitats and aquariums. I can add a little bit of isopropyl alcohol to my stamp, and just using pressure, have a really nice coral piece that's ready to go. So you can see all that textural detail coming up in that material. And then, like the other products we were talking about, it cures at room temperature. Now, you can use a post-curing process on some of these products to increase that heat deflection temperature. That's going to be on the technical bulletin, the instructions for use with each of these materials. Those can be found on our website. So if there is a post-cure process to help assist with those higher physical properties, like a higher heat deflection temperature, you want to observe that if that's something that you need for your specific application. But because I knew I was going to see you guys today, I went ahead and let one cure up. So this is actually a cured version of the Freeform Habitat Fire Safe that we were just talking about and demonstrated here, fully cured as opposed to the one we just made. Same texture stamp though, but you do get some variation even though you have a very similar texture content there. Now, stamps can be very, very deep in their texture, or they can be very low relief. That silicone is going to capture a detailed texture much finer than that of a fingerprint. So as it is, the one that I was just using with the Rebound 25, it does have some curvature to it, which lends itself really nicely to this form. I have a texture stamp here that was actually pulled off an amethyst geode, and you can see this has a very deep inset. So if you were going to use this to texture a piece, you wouldn't want to go all the way around it like we just did. You might be using it just to create one attribute that's very highly detailed. The nice thing about these stamps is that it allows you to work very quickly in the pot life of the Freeform Habitat materials over a large surface, or you could have multiple stamps if you have multiple people helping you out to make something very, very large. So with the habitat materials being more adhesive, that actually allows them to stick to PVC, EPS foam, so that you can do those texturing to create organic or very detailed forms with more control over a larger surface if you had a larger scaled part. And I'd be happy to talk with you a little bit more. I have quite a bit here for the texture stamps to be able to show you different materials you can use to do that. I will say that the Freeform Habitat Black that you see here, so for this aquarium piece, this is the Freeform Habitat Black. It does have a faster pot life than the material that you saw here with our Freeform Habitat, the flame rated material here, the Fire Safe. So this has a 60-minute working time in the black. It has a 90-minute working time with the Fire Safe. And both are really phenomenal. It just really depends on whether you're doing theming applications or aquariums and habitats, depending what the needs are for you to determine for your piece. But they both work very similarly. I will just say this is a little thicker to work with in terms of the mixed viscosity, and it gives you a little bit more processing time than the black. If you wanted the black to set up quicker and be a little softer, that's where I'd recommend this over the other. And then the folding powder, which we just talked about. So it gives you quite a few options there. So as far as the habitat products work, does anybody have any questions about what they just saw here?
Yeah, I got confused that you said the black was 90 minutes and the regular was 60, but you said the black was a faster working time?
I apologize if I misspoke or if it was confusing. To clarify, the FR is 90 minutes in the pot life to be able to work with that material. The cure time is longer before you can actually put that part into use. But from it going from a flexible state to a firmer state, and for it to be workable in that pot life, that's 90 minutes with the habitat FR that we were just talking about, the Fire Safe, and then the with the black it's 60 minutes. So I apologize if that got confused, but that's the difference. The black sets up faster. The fire safe has a longer pot life and that flame rating. Were there any other questions about these materials, or is everybody good? Okay, I see a lot of thumbs, so we'll go ahead and move on because I want to show you a little bit about these texture stamps and how you can make them to be able to use for your projects, and a little bit more about the detail that they can get into. So I'm going to move this out of the way. Give me just a moment. I'll be popping off screen for a second here.
So just wanted to mention really quickly, I put a link up there for a comparison tool on our site. If you're looking after this is over for like the differences between materials, their pot lives and things like that, this compare tool will allow you to kind of pick the materials, hit the link, and then you'll be able to see the differences in the materials, the difference in the color, the strength, pot life, and the cure time. I use it all the time, just so that I know what I'm looking at. So that's a pretty handy link for me. So it's a good. There's another question on here about, do the materials get harder the longer they cure, or will they always be fragile? Materials, that when we test them for strength, we let them sit for 7 days at room temperature. Okay, no matter what the material is. That's how we run our tests. So at 7 days, that material at room temperature is going to be as high performance as it will ever be. Okay, freeform air versus freeform sculpt. I can tell you the freeform air, because of that filler, that lower density filler, is going to have it's going to be easier to break in a similar thickness. Okay. And keep in mind that strength is really dependent on thickness. If you can get up to a 3/8 of an inch thick piece, that's going to greatly outperform something that's a 1/4 of an inch thick. The more, you'll get into diminishing returns at some point, but if you've got a robust piece, all of our tests are done at around the 3/8 of an inch point. So keep that in mind as well. That's all I wanted to mention.
Great. Yep. Thank you so much. That comparison tool is really valuable. Now, I'm not going to demonstrate mixing this material, but I do want to let you know, in the Freeform Habitat series, we do have a flexible material. It's the only flexible material in our products. Now, speaking about that thickness, this is a very thin section. So in a thicker section, you're not going to see that flex as much, but you can still see captures really beautiful detail. But I want to let you know there is a Habitat Flex. If you're looking for an option that has a little bit more impact resistance, that can bend or flex without being as brittle because it's not rigid when it's cured and reached those full physical properties. So to jump right off of what Jason was just talking about, this might be a really nice alternative if you're looking for a part that you want a little bit of flexibility in. That would be this option in the Freeform Habitat series. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the texture stamps, because we just mixed the Habitat materials, and what you saw was actually a rebound stamp that we use. This is a trial kit of the Rebound 25, and I told you that it captured really phenomenal detail, but I know sometimes people get a little confused as to what that texture means. So I have a piece here. It's like a really cheap, very highly glossy pumpkin surface, not very realistic, right? Not the same thing of something that is organic, that has all that detail and nooks and crannies and bumps and textural information. So let's get that out of the way. But I started one with the Rebound. Now, Rebound 25 normally is a mold rubber. So I could use this to create a brush on mold with a support shell if I wanted to. But let's say I needed to sculpt a very large pumpkin on top of foam, and I wanted to take that texture off of this to use and make a very believable part. So I'm just going to demold this Rebound 25 that I've applied on the surface. And you can see it bends and flexes. There's no support there, right? But it has outstanding detail for that stem and the minutia of those bumps and textures that came off this organic surface. So even if I have a surface that has very minimal detail and texturing, not as exaggerated as a very deep texture stamp, you can still use this to press into the material to reproduce and have more control over what that resulting surface looks like. I will say, because we were talking about hardness, I'm going to show you two different texture stamp materials that I use very commonly, and then we're going to pour one out of a silicone just to show you kind of how that works in action. This is our Equinox series. These are putties that you can press. They're platinum silicones that you can mix and press against your surfaces. I use this right on top of this pumpkin to do the same thing. But you can see this doesn't have the same flexibility that the Rebound 25 does. So this is the Equinox. I use the 35, which is the very fast setting one. And this is the Rebound 25. So this is 10 durometer firmer, even though it's still a silicone, it's a firmer silicone, which gives it a little more dimensional stability. However, when it comes to texture stamps, I prefer that 20 range to 25 range, because when I press it into the very soft freeform habitat material like the demonstration we just did, I can have more control over that material to get it to bend and shape around the contours of my substrates and surfaces. So it's very possible, and that's where I was saying to use these materials. That example we just did with the brain coral, here's one completely encapsulated so that I could press this against the surface and it holds those proportions a little better. So it really depends, again, the type of detail that you're trying to capture or how severe that detail is as to what materials you might be using to make a silicone stamp. I really like collecting a texture library of a whole lot of different textures. Sometimes, and I want to let you know, for those of you who do sculpt as well, it's even possible to sculpt and make your own textures. So we're going to pour a silicone into that stamp, but I want you to know that it's very possible to take them from surfaces like trees or sculptures that you've made, or many different mixed materials. So this is actually from a concrete block, and this has a much grainier surface texture that I could use to simulate that stone-like effect on top of the habitat. But if you do something like this, you will need to close off the porosity of your model. You're going to need to seal that very thoroughly so that the silicone, when you press it against the surface, doesn't bond onto it. Like with that pumpkin, you saw how easily that peeled away. You may find that you might need to use a sealing agent. Like with a stone like this, I might use sonite wax to really thoroughly fill in those pores, and then a release agent to help make it easier to take the silicone off of it. But it's very easy to make a stamp. And once you have one, you can use it in lots of different ways that are not just repeating textures. So I have a stamp here just of one fossil, just one. And that fossil was used in this example that you see on the table, trying to make sure the light hits it, so that there are many different fossils in this piece. So you don't have to have a repeating texture. There are times where you might have a piece just to add interest that you want to shape and press into your surface. So like if I had dinosaur feet and I wanted to create a path, I could press those in. In this case, there's several different fossil stamps used in this example to really create a whole illusionary ecosystem in the freeform habitat. And then you can actually, even because it's so adhesive, add pieces on, glue it down or embed it and reveal them as well out of those materials. So you can press these into molds like the mold that you saw before. It's just that you could easily have gaps from the application process if you don't have a gel coat or a detail coat like the epoxy coat on top of it. So keep that in mind, but it is possible to capture some of that detail by applying it to a silicone mold as opposed to just stamping it onto the surface. All right, so let's make a texture stamp that we can use so we can see this in action. We're going to mix up one of those Moldstar products we were talking about. This is the Moldstar 19T, and I've already prepared the part A and the part B, and I have a mold ready. So when I said not all materials are compatible, and you are always welcome to call our tech support and contact us to find out if your materials are compatible and what our recommendations are for sealing agents and release agents. What I can say is that silicone, platinum silicone, is not an option for all rubbers. This rubber, the Compleat 45, is actually a urethane rubber. The silicone won't want to stick to it as readily, and this particular silicone is compatible with it. So I don't need a release agent. I could use it if I wanted to make it easier to demold, but I won't require it for this project. So I dispensed out my part A, I dispensed out my part B, and I want to get one more mixing cup, because we're going to use this to do a double mix. But first, we're going to take our part A. And before I start, because we were talking about pot life before, I want to let you know this one has a very rapid one. The pot life is 3 minutes, and the demold time is 12 minutes. So we're going to be able to pull this stamp at room temperature before we end today, which is why I'm using it now. But we're going to have to work quickly once we combine this part A and part B together. So I pre-mixed the material and dispensed it out 1-to-1 by volume. And that's why you see I have the same amount in that part A, the same amount of that part B, and they're going to go together, and we're going to move quickly. And I'm using a mixing stirrer that has a nice flat bottom. Scraping the sides, scraping the bottom of the container. And I'm going to transfer this mix to a new, clean, disposable mixing cup. And this is called a double mix technique. It's helping me make sure that I don't have any unmixed material sticking to the sides or bottom of my container that could create an incomplete mix. So again, I'm mixing just a little bit more. Scrape those sides, scrape that bottom. And then I'm going to pour in a long, thin stream into my mold in just the lowest point and let that material spread out, displacing air as it goes. So that those bubbles rise and escape. Now, because of how quick this sets, I am going to move just a little bit and chase that leading edge so that it doesn't set up before we have that full stamp poured. So the mold is Compleat 45, which is a urethane rubber that's compatible with some platinum silicone systems. And the mold rubber that you see me pouring is a translucent Moldstar 19T, which can allow me quickly to make many texture stamps that I can use on these putty products. So even though I might use a brushable mold rubber to make my initial texture, I can create a master that I can pour a mold around to make a mold that I can reuse many times to cast as many new stamps as I need. And I'll show you just an example of the master that was used to make this mold. But the original came from a tree texture, an actual tree bark texture. And as you can see, that material is filled into all those nooks and crannies, and those bubbles are popping all the way down. And I might stop right there. So I might tip the mold just a little bit just to get in that base down there. Yep. Let gravity help us out, right? That's a lot of the things we've been featuring with these materials, is knowing how weight is distributed on your part and ways to have more control over reducing that or applying it where you want it to be. And then we'll let that set up. So as I told you, I'm going to show you that master that's pulled off of. Here it is. So that ultimately we're going to get a texture that looks like the tree bark that you see that was used to create this example. This is actually freeform air. So even though it's lower density, that's why I could lift this so easily. It's very lightweight. Has a hollow interior, because ultimately what you see on the outside is really what matters there in terms of making a believable shape, but there are different ways to add strength. So this is built on top of a burlap saturated with epoxamite shell interior, and that whole top layer that makes it so believable on this side has just been painted with that freeform air, and additional embellishments have been sculpted with the freeform air to create moss and lichen. So many different ways to use these materials to create a very organic or realistic effect. But it utilized this same texture that you're seeing here, and the stamp was pressed all along that surface to create a consistent textural effect. But it was hand-shaped with a flexible tool that was made and designed not to be adhesive to that putty. That's really the basics of what I was trying to show you today to help you get started and see different ways these materials can be used. If there is more that you would like to know about any of these examples, I think we're going to go into those last questions of the night. I'd be happy to answer anything I can for you. And then in the next few minutes, when we end the cure time of this material, so it's gone from a liquid into that gel state, it's ended its pot life, we're going to wait for this cure time and then pull this at the end of our questions, and we're wrapping up for tonight. I hope you guys got a lot of really good tips and techniques while you were visiting with us here. Again, my name's Janessa. I'd be happy to answer anything I can for you now before we wrap up this evening.
There don't seem to be any questions in the text yet. I think you answered all the questions, so you can probably, hand out the quiz now and everybody will pass. I don't know if you can hear me. I don't know if you can hear me. Am I on?
You should be on. Isn't talking.
I'm sorry, if someone can repeat that question, I had a hard time hearing you here.
Can you guys hear me?
There we go.
Okay, sorry about that. I said that there don't appear to be any individual questions into the text yet, so I think everybody understands everything perfectly now, and we're all ready for the quiz. If you want to hand out the pop quiz.
Well, in that case, there's no quiz, but I can show you something like we were talking about we went into all that on the basics of sculpting, right? And scaling up your projects. I'm going to show you one of my favorite scaled up projects. You guys are going to make sure I get a workout tonight. I'll tell you that. So this is Freeform Habitat Black, and this is a big baby. So this baby penguin was made not with a texture stamp, but actually sculpted in shape with tools by hand. But what I want to show you, the really neat thing about him, is I wouldn't have been able to lift him up on my own if he wasn't hollow on the inside. So he started out as newsprint. And once that initial layer was set up, then I could sculpt those details on top and add the beaks and the wings and the feet, so that even though he's pretty massive and pretty dense, he actually weighs an amount that I can handle easily to move him from place to place, while still being very strong. Although I will say, if I ever make his parents, they're going to be much bigger than me. So this is a really good size to start out with in terms of a smaller scale monumental kind of test. So this is even the texture stamps can be incredible tools to help you have more control over that surface and work quickly, because you have to work within that batch. But I want you to know, because the materials stick to themselves, because the epoxy putties we've been talking about are very adhesive, you can build those up. And in terms of that scale of your project, that's something you can take into account to help create, much larger scale pieces than some of what we've demonstrated here on camera. So nice little appearance from him today.
What tool did you use for his texture? Wooden?
I use the same wood tool that you saw. Just dip it in water and spread it across the surface. That's it.
With any of the tools that you're going to use, if they're wood, dipping them in water helps. If they're steel or plastic, you can also put a tiny little bit of release agent onto them, and that will act as an oil, as a barrier to prevent it from sticking to the tools. So you can use your good clay tools and wax tools to work with these materials. Just release them first, otherwise the epoxy is going to stick to it. We also had one other quick question that came in from Cynthia. Hi, Cynthia, by the way. She would like to know the library life of the materials after they're cured. Most of these epoxy products and plastics are going to last longer than we will, but it's dependent on environment and care. So, interior, exterior applications, but they do have an extensive library life.
So I understand that the question is regarding the library life of the materials themselves. I do want to say up front that there are way more variables that I'm ever going to be able to tell you how long your part's going to last specifically. But I do want to say that it sounds like what you're asking about too is indoor or outdoor applications. Some of these materials can be used for exteriors when they're painted. So you'll see those recommendations on the technical bulletins for the different materials. It was like when I was telling you about the different needs, such as aquariums or habitat pieces. I can tell you that the material itself is not going to go back to a putty state. Once it's fully cured, it's not going to return back to a liquid, which is incredible that this happens at room temperature. What we were doing today, you didn't see me using any equipment like an oven or the application of heat to be able to get it going from that soft to that hard state. And some of it happened right in front of us. But in terms of your environmental condition, something I do want to point out is you want to be aware of that heat deflection temperature of your material. What that refers to is when that material is going to distort and become flexible instead of being rigid, and what temperature that occurs with. We do have some high temperature materials that are going to work better for different environmental needs. So, every environment is different. So we were talking to someone from Maine or someone from Texas, you're going to have very different temperature ranges in those locations. But once the material is cured, it's inert. It's not going to go back to that liquid state. So in terms of how that works for you, there might be a lot of different factors that contribute to your application. We can talk about those challenges if you reach out to us too. As I was telling you, we do offer technical support here at Smooth On a one-to-one basis. But I would always recommend doing a test piece or small maquette to practice with, to observe how that material is going to perform in your environment and to see what your needs are in terms of the thickness of the material. Like I was going to say that with the freeform sculpt, I have an example here along the lines. I'm going to step away. I'll be right back. Don't panic. I'll be right here. You might have seen him here on the table. This was actually a freeform sculpt piece that was built. The mass that was filled in was done with freeform air to help keep him I've been joking that it's a baby dolphin simulator, but I promise he doesn't bite. The freeform air I exposed and sanded so that you can see that there is the air underneath the freeform sculpt in this example. But I wanted to show you the substrate is an EPS foam. So you can see that mass of freeform air that's been built up around the foam, which let me help control weight and ultimately decide where I wanted to add more mass and more thickness. But I wanted you to keep in mind that depending on the nature of your application, you might have substrates underneath that are going to need to perform under those conditions too. You might have a piece that's mixed media that has elements that are adhered on the top. So how those all work together are going to be really different project to project. I hope that helps answer your question though, that they do, in terms of being cured, some of these pieces have lasted for years. I actually believe that the penguin that you just saw there is not in baby penguin years, but in human years is about 6 or 7 years old at this point, just in an interior environment. So I hope that helps in terms of kind of understanding some of what the materials can and want to do. All right. So remember how I said I get really touchy and I want to touch things before they've cured. One of the nice things about keeping a cup next to you when you're working is that you can use these as your example. So now I'm touching that material and it's not coming away. It's not liquid anymore. I'm using this as my test cup for the mold here. Now I could give this just a little bit of more time, but I can tell you it's gone into its beyond its gel state. It's getting to that point where it's no longer liquid. It's not tacky. It's not sticking to my hand at all. So I'm going to go ahead and demold it. But I do want to ask before I do this, if there was anything else anybody wanted to know that I didn't get to yet. Any questions in the chat? Nope. Well, thank you guys so much for making this so much fun and participating with us tonight. I'm going to go ahead and pull this out of the compact mold. It is a little bit flexible, but we're right at that point where it's reaching its cure time.
I had a question about the penguin.
Sure. There we go. There's our texture stamp ready to go.
So you used newsprint to fill out the mass. That I assume that's what you pulled out to keep it hollow.
Yep.
And then how did you build the exterior, and how did you attach the wings? Did you add an armature, or was it just freeform sculpt? Which ones were you using?
Okay, so that's a great question. The question was about the baby penguin and what armatures that I used. You're right, the wings did have foam core armatures. I used the paper. I built up the wings on it and then attached it. So originally I roughed out the foam. This is a process very popular with ceramicists where they may choose to burn away the paper in the interior. In this case, we're not using any heat. So we don't need that armature after that material goes from the liquid to the solid. Now, in a lot of cases, like the aluminum foil armatures you saw before, they might be fully encapsulated in material. In this case, that paper I left exposed so I could reach in and just pull it all out and empty it out. And that gave me a shell that I could then sculpt on top of. I'll tell you that almost all of the sculpting was done when I pulled that paper out because that material is so quick and easy to work with. And then I could use the Freeform Habitat Black to adhere the wings on and then add more material on top of it to do the detailing on the wings so it didn't just look like foam core. But it's very easy to use paper or fabric as armature structures. If something to think of though is whether you want the epoxy putty to bond to it or release from it. This is something we talked about before, and what I will say is that adhesive property can work to your advantage. And if it's something that you don't want to bond it onto, that's where you'd be looking to use release agents or other options to keep, like the silicone stamps, not the fact that they're not as adhesive to the epoxy putty to use to your advantage one way or the other. Just in general, keep in mind the Freeform Sculpt, the Freeform Air series, the Freeform Habitat series, they're generally very adhesive. They want to stick. So there are workarounds for that. I will say one thing though, if I had used aluminum foil and I kind of covered a surface and then covered it with the putty, it might be possible for me to remove that from whatever my form was, as long as I didn't get a mechanical lock. So there are times where like I may lay down a piece of paper and sculpt on top of that so that it adheres to that paper, it adheres to that aluminum foil and not the surface underneath. If I just want some very general contours, that's something that you could use, but I will say be careful with that, because you don't want the pressure of working the material to displace your form underneath. You don't want that to fall off. You really want to make sure that that can cure in the position that you leave it, so you can maximize the amount of effort you put into making your sculpture. And that's really the point of what we're doing here tonight, giving you some tools to help you make those end result with more control, with more ease, and really pick the right tool for the job and use it to its strengths. So that's why we had a few different options we looked at that all do different things. If it comes to making a large piece or keeping that material even thinner but highly detailed, that's where I recommend the Freeform Habitat series. The Freeform Sculpt offers a lot more detail than the Freeform Air, but the Freeform Air, being so lightweight, offers you a lot of different options for your projects that really there are no materials out there like it.
Janessa, this is Mark back at TCS again.
Hi, Mark.
Just wanted to throw in one last $1 million question, because you spent at least 5,000 hours on that penguin. But Gina would like to know how many hours you actually put into that to create that form.
I heard you up until right at that very end.
So Gina would like to know how many hours it took you to make the penguin.
Oh, the penguin?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is a really easy question to answer. I only had 60 minutes to make it before the material went from a putty to a solid. So he came together in a day. He came together in about 3 hours. And in terms of the effort that was put into him, it was actually less than that, because it was about 3, possibly 4 batches. I will say the beak was its own batch, because I wanted to get that expression in terms of 60-minute intervals. So I was moving quick.
Well, at that rate, we'll take 100 of them.
Well, thank you for the commission, but he's one of a kind.
Okay.
But anyway, I'm glad you guys thought he was a treat. That's why I was saving him for the end.
Absolutely.
He's been my audience while I've been practicing here for the class.
You did a fantastic job, and thank you so much. We're gonna wrap it up for everybody now. If there are any more questions, now's the time. Also, we're gonna send out an email with follow-up emails for Janessa and for myself. So if you guys have any questions, you'll be able to reach us by email. And again, there's plenty of resources on the Smooth On website, on our website, and we really want to thank you all for spending your time and wasting a Wednesday evening with us. And enjoy all of your company. It's great to see everybody, even digitally, and just say hi and make sure we're all still healthy and safe out there. So thank you again so much. And look for that forward email. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out.
Stay safe out there. Thank you guys for joining us tonight. Thank you for everything, Compleat Sculptor. I'm glad you were here, Mark. Thank you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you, Janessa. You did awesome. Great job.